The widow heard the laughter before she ever laid the first stone. It carried across the frost-bitten meadow where the other settlers had gathered near the half-finished corral, rang like a cracked bell in the brittle air. It wasn't loud, not that kind of laughter, but the kind meant to carry just far enough. Chuckles hidden behind sleeves, side-eyes shared between men who'd never lifted a child in their arms after burying their wife in frozen earth. A couple of women smirked too, but quieter, like they didn't want to be caught doing it. That was always how it went. A woman alone, building anything that wasn't a crib or a coffin. That was enough to stir mouths loose. But what set them off this time wasn't her hammering or hauling. It was what she was building, what she dared to call a meat cellar in December. Not just December, the worst one in years. The snow had fallen earlier than usual, too much. Too fast. By the third week, doors had already been buried, and the mountains had gone from treacherous to suicidal. Wagons were stuck, trails washed out, and the last cow drive had returned weeks short, bones showing through their flanks. Folks were already cutting into their salted pork, some skipping meals altogether. A hard freeze was whispering the same thing into every settler's ear. You didn't prepare enough. And yet there was the widow, Martha Ellen Greaves, digging into the earth like it was springtime, and the world hadn't turned white and cruel overnight. She didn't flinch at the laughter, didn't even turn to acknowledge the shifting crowd behind her, the way their voices crept closer just to catch a better glimpse of her folly. She just kept digging, paused only to adjust the rag-wrapped hands of her son Daniel, 6, who had started shivering against the handle of the spade. Beside them, her daughter Rachel, 4, pulled ice clumps from the half-rolled canvas meant to cover the pit's mouth once it was ready. Every motion was deliberate, controlled. She'd already decided what she'd do if anyone came close, and someone did. "Buried meat, Miss Greaves?" asked the voice, casual as if offering her firewood. She looked up. It was Benjamin Colt, sheriff, widower, friendly in public, careful in private, the kind who always offered help with a pitying slant. His hands were in his coat pockets, but his eyes kept flicking to her children, more than once. She didn't smile. "Cold keeps things longer," she said, straightening. "Even when the firewood don't." Colt tilted his head. "And you're expecting to store what exactly?" "Anything that don't rot." He hesitated, then chuckled, like a man giving a gentle rebuke. "Folks are saying it'll freeze solid down there. You won't be able to chip out a single piece without breaking your knife, or your wrist." She glanced at him, then down at Daniel, who had stopped digging, and now stared at the sheriff with something unreadable in his face. "Fear, maybe? Or just silence, learned too early," she replied slowly. "Folks said it was foolish to marry a schoolteacher with no land. Then they buried him before the first spring melt." That took the smile from Colt's mouth. He looked at the hole again. "Just be careful, this snow isn't letting up. Would hate to lose you under it." She didn't answer, just knelt and resumed digging. He didn't return the next day, but the laughter did. They mocked the dirt she piled up, called it a molehill feast. One man even offered to lend her his last hen, said maybe she could freeze it so solid it'd hatch again come thaw. His wife slapped his shoulder but giggled anyway. No one lifted a finger to help, but she kept digging. By the fourth day, the frost in the topsoil had thickened into dense clay that threatened to crack her shovel. She switched to a rusted pickaxe, hammering deeper inch by inch while her fingers bled beneath cloth. The cellar was shaped into a half-moon recess against the rocky ridge, partially hidden under drifted snowbanks. It wasn't deep, no time for that, but it angled inward, with a narrow throat that widened into a dark pocket she reinforced with salvaged timber and stone. When the last stone was rolled in, she sat inside it with Rachel asleep in her lap and Daniel stacking split kindling by the cellar mouth. She didn't speak, she just listened. The silence around her wasn't peaceful, it was pressure, a silence made of hunger, not yet spoken aloud. They weren't starving yet, but it was coming. She could feel it in her children's bones. The meat came next, but not all at once. What little they had left she wrapped in layers of cloth soaked in vinegar and ashes, an old trick from her mother's letters. Cuts from a half-starved deer the boy had helped her drag home in October, chunks of rabbit, hunks of cured pork fat, a handful of preserved root vegetables from the frost-bit garden. Every scrap was wrapped, tagged and packed tight against sawdust and ash, layered inside the cellar like precious bricks. The townsfolk laughed even harder then. "Hope she enjoys her dirt stew," someone shouted one morning, loud enough for her children to hear. She said nothing, but Daniel didn't. He stood at the edge of the property, fists balled, cheeks red, until she had to drag him back by the collar of his coat. "Don't waste breath on them," she muttered. Save it for the next storm, because it was coming. They all knew it. What they didn't know was how deep she'd already seen it. Not with her eyes, but in the brittle cough of the blacksmith's boy. In the way the trading post had closed early without explanation. In the way Colt had offered her firewood that didn't come from his own stack. No one had enough, but they still had pride. Pride let them laugh at her while cutting back on supper. Pride let them ride past her half-buried roof and scoff at the smoke-thin chimney, even as their own hearths grew silent. And when the second storm came, blinding, week-long, colder than the first, it didn't knock politely. It howled. It took the roof off the trading post. It froze the well. It snapped the boards on a dozen cabins and turned the snow into jagged teeth. Men went out hunting and didn't return. A woman miscarried and bled to death before help could find her. No one laughed then. And the widow? She kept her fire low, rationed kindling to every other night, and disappeared from sight. No one saw her for 5 days. Some assumed she had frozen to death with her children in the cabin. Some whispered maybe she'd abandoned it. One woman said she saw smoke, but none believed her. It was only after the 6th day, when the wind had stilled and the sun rose like a bruised eye behind the frost fog, that Benjamin Colt rode out again. He approached slow, not like a sheriff, but like a man scared to find what he half expected. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again. Then the door creaked open, and there she stood, pale, yes, eyes sunken, but standing. Behind her, the children wrapped in quilts, quiet but awake. She didn't invite him in, just looked him dead in the eye. And then came the smell, rich, smoky, familiar. He looked past her and saw it, barely, a strip of meat, slow roasting over a low ember flame. It wasn't much, but it was real, not dried, not leather. She said nothing. He nodded and left. He didn't tell anyone what he saw, not that day, but word got out anyway. And that's when the visits began. They came quiet at first. A knock here, a boot print left in the snow. Then they came in twos. A woman with her child, red in the face from windburn. An older man clutching his coat shut with shaking fingers. One by one, they came to the edge of the widow's claim and stopped. Not daring to knock, but not willing to walk away either. They hovered like ghosts at the tree line, waiting to see if she would turn them away or worse, pretend not to see them at all. But she saw everything. Martha Greaves always did. She saw the gaunt faces behind frostbitten scarves, saw the eyes darting not to her face but to the chimney, to the smoke. Thin, yes, but steady. A signal, a beacon in the snow. She never invited them in. Instead, she stepped out with a wool shawl around her shoulders and a flat, unreadable expression. Her voice came quiet, but not soft. "I can spare broth." And that's how it started. No charity, no long stories, no Bible verses read aloud while hands were rubbed near the fire. She brought out what she could. Thimble-sized tin mugs with warm liquid, chunks of dried roots softened in boiled snowmelt, slivers of rabbit or venison rationed so carefully it made her stomach twist just to hand them over. Some left grateful, tears frozen on their lashes. Others tried to leave coins behind. She never took them. Daniel didn't understand at first. "But why give anything, Ma? You said we barely had..." "Enough. I said we barely had enough to share like kings," she told him, wrapping a scarf tighter around Rachel's chin. "But scraps save lives too." She didn't tell him the rest. That sharing meant fewer temptations for desperate hands, that keeping people from starving too fast kept them from doing the kind of things men did when they believed their children might not wake come morning. She didn't say what she feared most wasn't the storm, but the ones who lived through it. So she gave scraps, and in doing so she bought time. But winter doesn't trade in mercy, not for long. The next storm didn't wait even a full week. It came fast, blowing from the north like a curse, and this time it stayed. By mid-January, the settlement had lost 2 more men, a woman gone mad with frostbite who'd wandered from her bed and vanished. The snow rose past windowsills. Chickens froze to their roosts. Dogs went quiet. And still, there was laughter. Bitter now, resentful. "Hope the widow's still playing Queen of the Snow Pantry," one man spat near the post. "Must be nice to feed folks. Like she's got a magic cave full of hams." No one corrected him. But they noticed. The way she walked through town once a week, quiet, head down, collecting odds and ends, ashes, root peelings, cloth scraps, wood shards. She never asked for meat, never bartered for flour, and that unsettled people. It wasn't natural. Even those who had tasted her soup began to ask questions, not aloud, but in whispers. How could she still have food? What trick was she using? And why didn't she ever look hungry? Martha knew it was only a matter of time. The snow hadn't let up in 14 days. The meat cellar, buried deeper than ever now, was the only reason they hadn't resorted to boiling the soles off their boots. But her stores were shrinking. Not fast, not reckless, but enough that she could feel the edge drawing closer. She rationed more, cut portions in half again, hid what she had not just from others, but from the children. They were too young to understand slow starvation. They only knew that their mother's hands shook more when she stirred the pot, and that the broth tasted thinner each night. Daniel began waking up with dry lips. Rachel whimpered in her sleep. Martha lay awake for hours, counting each hidden parcel in the cellar. She tried to stretch the fat drippings into something resembling a stew. She used snowmelt thickened with pine bark flour, and when it still wasn't enough, she ground up acorns, boiled them thrice to remove the bitterness, and mixed that into the mash. It bought them days, but only days. Then came the scratching. It was near midnight when she heard it, a faint scraping at the cellar hatch. Too deliberate to be an animal, too soft to be wind. She rose without a sound, wrapped herself in her husband's old wool coat, and stepped outside with a lantern low and a hand on the hatchet she kept by the door. The wind was cruel, lashing her cheeks raw in seconds, but she moved fast. The cellar mound was nearly invisible beneath the drift, but she knew every stone. She reached it in silence. Then she saw them, two figures, both crouched low, barely shadows against the white, one with his arm inside the hatch, the other holding a lantern near the entrance. Young, starved. One of them, she recognized, Thomas Mickelson's boy, whose mother had died last winter. They froze when she approached. She said nothing for a long moment. The wind howled around them, whipping the scarf from her neck. Then steady. "You picked the wrong hill to dig," the boy with his hand in the cellar stammered. We just wanted, Ma said there's food in there, and you wanted to steal from my children's mouths," she cut in, voice hard. "You would have left them to starve." The other one looked down. "We were gonna leave something, trade, just don't got nothing left." Silence again. Then she spoke. "You could have knocked." The first boy, close to crying now, whispered, "Didn't think you'd say yes." Martha knelt slowly, lifted the cellar lid herself, and removed a bundle, small, rag-wrapped, light enough she could barely feel its weight anymore. She shoved it into his chest. "Take it, but next time you ask." They stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Why?" Her voice cracked. "Because when the storm takes your mother and your brother, and you're left feeding two babies on ash and hope, maybe then you'll remember what it means to be human." She turned and walked away. She didn't look back to see if they left. Inside the cabin, Daniel watched her from the window. He didn't ask what happened, but he laid another log on the fire that night, even though they were only supposed to burn one every 2 days. The next morning, someone left a bundle on the widow's doorstep. 3 strips of squirrel meat, a cracked mug, and a child's mitten. No note. It kept happening. More bundles, quietly delivered, never claimed. A piece of jerky here, a tin of dried beans, half a salt cake, sometimes even bits of rope or patch cloth. No one said anything. No one thanked her. But the air began to shift. She took what she could use and buried the rest, not in the cellar, but behind the cabin. In case, because she knew better than to think the thaw was coming anytime soon, and she was right. February arrived with a vengeance. The temperature plummeted again. Chickens were long gone. Even the dogs were starting to vanish. The river froze to the depth of 2 axe heads. A child died in her sleep 3 cabins over. Colt came by again. He didn't ask for food. He didn't try to charm. He brought her a crate of wood and stood in silence as she divided it into usable lengths. Then quietly, "They're scared. Of the cold," he looked at her. "Of what comes after." She didn't flinch. "Then they best keep their hands busy." But what she didn't say, what she hadn't even told Daniel, was that the last wrapped parcel was gone. The cellar was empty, and all that remained were bones. The bones didn't speak, but they had weight. She could feel them, even with her back turned to the empty cellar, as if they pressed against the air itself. A silence so thick and grim she didn't dare let Rachel follow her inside anymore. Even Daniel, who'd taken to peering in after her on occasion, had stopped coming close the moment he saw her kneeling over a cloth sack and tying it shut without a word. He knew better than to ask. That was the thing about children raised in snow. They learned to read death not by screams, but by silence. There was nothing left to cut, nothing left to thaw. Not even the sour smell of meat she once feared would draw desperate noses had remained. The cellar was not a vault anymore. It was a grave for what had been their hope. Cold, hollow, dead, and she had to act like nothing had changed. So Martha Greaves did what all women with mouths to feed and no food left do. She lied. She cut thinner slices of bone dust soup, flavored them with bark and ash. She burned pieces of leather soaked in salt water and told Daniel it was medicinal broth. She held Rachel when her belly ached at night and told her it was a sign she was growing strong, like the girls in the stories. She smiled. God help her, she smiled. When the children asked what they would eat tomorrow, she said, "Something warm," and her voice didn't even crack. But inside, something was shifting. It wasn't panic. She'd lived through panic before, when James died of fever and left her alone with 2 children and no mule. Panic had a heartbeat, a rhythm. It passed, usually with a decision made in fear. No, what filled her now was slower, darker, a kind of drifting despair. The knowledge that there would be no relief, that the snow would keep falling, that help would not come, and that her children were going to starve, unless she found something. So on the morning after the last marrow scrap had been boiled to dust, she told Daniel to stay in and look after his sister, then wrapped herself in every layer she owned and took the hatchet. She didn't tell him where she was going. She didn't know herself. She just walked. It was 10 degrees below freezing and snow up to her thighs. Her boots were patched with twine and bark. Her legs ached before the cabin disappeared from view, but she didn't stop. She pushed deeper into the tree line, past the place where the soil had buckled under the last storm, past the blackened husk of the Kinley boys' snare post. She looked for tracks. None. She looked for scat. None. Even the squirrels had gone silent. Somewhere between a pine snag and a frost-split boulder, her knee buckled. She dropped hard, snow smashing into her face, hatchet falling with a muffled thump. She stayed there, breath ragged, heart hammering like it was trying to leap from her ribs. She could have cried, but crying wasted water, and she wasn't ready to die. Not yet. She picked herself up, dragged the hatchet from the snow, and started forward again. That's when she found the blood, a single drop dark against the ice crust, then another and another, a trail, broken but real. She followed it, slow, cautious, praying it wasn't just the remains of something already picked clean by carrion. Her hands gripped the hatchet so tight her fingers screamed. The trail led to a fallen tree, half buried, and behind it, movement. She froze. A deer, young, weak, one leg clearly broken, the other scraping against the ground as it tried to flee. It didn't get far. The first strike took it in the flank, the second behind the neck. She didn't wait for it to die. She worked fast. Fast enough she didn't even realize she was crying until the tears started to freeze on her cheeks. She didn't have a sled, no rope. She dragged the carcass, mile by mile. It took 4 hours. By the time she reached the cabin, her arms were numb, legs shaking, and her lips cracked from cold and thirst. She dropped to her knees in front of the door, body draped across the half-frozen kill, and tried to call out. No sound came, but Daniel opened the door anyway. He didn't scream. He just looked at her, then at the deer, and without a word, reached for the hatchet she still clutched in her hand. They worked all night. The blood froze as it poured. They couldn't waste time with ritual or clean skinning. Martha carved what she could. Strips of muscle, lengths of tendon, the heart and liver and lungs all bundled in rags. Daniel dragged snow to help pack the meat. Rachel stirred from sleep once, saw the work in the lantern glow, and went back to bed without a sound. They ate that night. Not a feast, not even enough. But it was meat, real, hot, and they lived for another week, and then another. But the snow did not stop. Even with the deer, she knew it was borrowed time. What she didn't expect, what no one did, was the thaw. Not spring, no. Just a sudden rise in temperature that turned the top layer of snow into slush, then froze it again into sheets of ice, a cruel trick of weather. And with it came sickness. It started with a cough. Rachel, dry, then wet, then ragged. Her eyes reddened. She stopped eating, curled in the corner of the cabin beneath the thickest quilts they had, and didn't speak for a day. Then Daniel, paler now, thinner than a boy his age had any right to be. He tried to hide the chills, the fever flush in his cheeks, but Martha saw. Of course she saw. What mother wouldn't? She burned the last of the pine pitch, ground up what herbs she had left, bitter roots, dried yarrow, a scrap of red willow bark, and boiled it into tea. She fed it to them in spoons, kissed their foreheads, and told them they were getting better. They weren't, and now she had to choose between watching them fade or doing something no mother should ever have to consider. She thought of the town, of the ones who'd whispered, of the cellar. She thought of those who still had food and kept it hidden, of the men who hadn't come to her door not because they had nothing, but because they thought she didn't have the strength to knock on theirs. And she thought of Benjamin Colt. She wrapped herself again. This time, she took the rifle. She didn't want to bring the rifle. But by the time you're walking through freezing dusk with both your children running fever and coughing blood in their sleep, you stop caring about appearances. Pride was for those who had something left to protect. She had nothing but bones and scraps and a dwindling thread of firewood. And even that would burn out before Rachel's fever did. If she knocked now, with empty hands, they might laugh again. But not if she had the rifle. The storm had stilled just enough for the wind to pull back, and the sun was sinking into that bruised purple edge of sky, the kind that made the trees look like skeletal fingers. She didn't follow the road. She cut crossways through the dead frozen pasture, past the old well where the Prewitt girl had drowned last fall, past the timber piles she'd bartered a quilt for 2 winters ago. Every step crunched and cracked, and once her foot went through a brittle patch and she sunk to her knee in ice water. She didn't even gasp. By the time she reached the edge of the Colt property, Her skirts were frozen to her thighs, and her rifle was icing over at the latch. She kept moving. The Colt cabin was one of the few with smoke still climbing strong from the chimney. He'd always had firewood, always managed to keep his boots dry and his animals fed even when no one else could. Rumor said he'd built an underground store before the first frost, stacked with cured meat and barrels of grain, but no one had seen it. He never confirmed it, never denied it either. He opened the door before she could knock. "Martha," his voice didn't betray surprise, just a tired resignation, like he'd been waiting. "I need something," she said. "Anything." He studied her a long moment, then stepped aside. Inside, the fire burned high and steady, casting the log walls in golden shadow. There was a stew pot over the hearth. She smelled it before she saw it. Salt, marrow, something heavy with fat. Her stomach clenched so hard she had to bite the inside of her cheek just to keep from staggering. "You'll catch frost in your lungs if you don't sit," he said. She stepped in, didn't sit. He let the silence stretch for a moment, then turned to the pot, ladled a bowl, and set it on the table. "I'll give you what I can, but it's not much." Her eyes flicked to the shelf behind him. Jars, racks, something wrapped in cloth that looked like dried sausage. "Not much," he said. "I don't need charity," she said. He nodded. "Didn't say you did." He set a sack on the table. "3 days' worth. You come back next week. I'll see what else there is." She didn't move. "Martha," he said gently. "I know. I heard. The children. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said, her voice raw. "Be honest. How much do you have left?" He paused, then lifted his eyes to hers. "Enough." That word twisted something deep inside her. It wasn't meant cruelly. It wasn't a gloat, but it landed like a stone. "Then why haven't you shared it?" His brow furrowed. "I have, quietly. You know that. You fed those who could walk to your door. You didn't ask who couldn't." He said nothing. "I saw your traps. They've been full all month." He looked at the rifle in her hand. "You're not here to accuse me," he said softly. "You're here because your children are dying. Take the food. Don't make this a thing we can't come back from." She didn't answer. Something in her broke then, not in rage, not in grief, but in clarity. She saw what she must have looked like to him, ragged, half-frozen, a mother too far gone to beg, but not brave enough to steal, a rifle not raised, but still present. She couldn't tell if he pitied her or respected her, and it didn't matter. She reached for the sack. "I won't be back next week," he flinched. Don't talk like that. I'll find more, elsewhere." "You won't. You know you won't." She looked at him, and for the first time, he looked scared. Not of her, but for her. "I have more," he said quickly. "I just can't give too much at once. If I give too much, then they'll all come. The whole town. I've seen what happens when one house becomes the last one standing." She nodded slowly. "I know," she said. She took the sack, walked out without another word. He didn't stop her. She didn't cry until she was halfway home. The tears burned, then froze on her cheeks. Back at the cabin, Daniel didn't speak when she entered. He just helped her unpack. The boy had gone quiet in a way that frightened her more than anything, like he was watching the world die and trying not to make it worse. Rachel was still fevered, but her breathing had steadied. Martha fed her slowly, spoon by spoon, until her daughter whimpered, curled into the blanket, and fell asleep. She turned to Daniel. "Tomorrow," she said, "we dig again." He blinked. "Ma, we'll build another pit. Not as deep, just enough for snowpack and stones. I've got 2 root bundles left and half a sack of colt's meat. We'll bury it before the thaw takes it." Daniel swallowed. "You think there'll be a thaw?" "Not yet," she said, "but there'll be rats, or worse." He nodded. They dug the next morning, and the morning after. No one came that week, no one knocked. Then on the 4th day, a girl, barely older than Rachel, wandered to the cabin and collapsed in the snow outside. Martha found her by the frozen trough. She was blue in the lips, her hands raw, wrapped in torn socks. She didn't speak for hours, only drank the broth in tiny sips. When she finally opened her mouth, her voice was brittle. "My pa's dead," she said. "He told me to come here, said you had a cellar." Martha didn't ask his name. She just nodded and gave her another bowl. That night she watched the flames and realized she'd lost count of how many mouths she'd fed. Some stayed, some passed through, some came back with scraps to trade. Not all made it, but none left empty. She stopped trying to track every ration. She rationed her hope instead. Until one morning Daniel ran to the window and shouted, "Ma, look!" She rushed to the door. There, in the distance, across the silver-crusted field, a figure on horseback was approaching. Behind him, 2 wagons, covered, heavy. Relief convulsed in her chest, almost made her drop to her knees. The wagons bore the seal of the governor's relief trail. Supplies, medicine, food, they had come, at last. But the moment she stepped into the light, the laughter returned. Not cruel, not mocking. This time, it came from the man on the lead horse, pale-faced and wide-eyed as he took in the cabin. "The snow buried the whole damn valley," he said, voice hoarse with awe. "We thought no one could have lasted out here, but you've got smoke in the chimney and color in your cheeks. How? Martha didn't answer. Daniel stepped forward, chin high. "We have a cellar," he said, "buried under the snow. My ma built it." The man blinked. "A cellar?" "Meat cellar," Daniel said, voice low and proud. "It kept us fed all winter." Silence. Then the man laughed again, not cruel, but in wonder. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Guess some folks still know how to beat the freeze." He turned to the wagons. "Bring up the medicine first. There's children here." They set up camp nearby. Rachel was treated with real tinctures and broth richer than Martha had seen in years. Daniel's cough vanished in 2 days. The girl from the trough found a place on one of the wagons, headed toward a relative she barely remembered. People returned to the widow's cabin not for scraps, but to ask how she'd done it, how she'd survived. She told them the truth. "I built a cellar." "But that can't be it," one insisted. "It was just a hole in the ground, wasn't it?" She smiled, cold as the snow that had buried them all. "It was deep enough to carry us through. That's all a grave or a cellar ever is." They didn't laugh after that. By the time spring truly came, slow and bashful through the mud and the frost-rotted underbrush, the town had changed. Not in the way that fresh flowers change a table, or new paint changes a wall. No, something underneath had shifted. Settlers who had once shared everything from laughter to derision had grown quiet, thinner, older, marked by the months of cold that had stripped every soul bare down to the bone. But one cabin had stayed warm, not because of what was in it, but because of what had been built beneath it. The widow's snow-buried meat cellar became more than a hole in the ground. It became a legend, not loud, not sung, but whispered, passed between men sharpening axes and women kneading bread again for the first time in weeks. "Did you hear what she did?" they asked, not with mockery now, but awe. "Built it before the snow even started. Packed it with enough to keep her children breathing when most of us couldn't keep a fire going." They didn't say her name at first. There was something fragile in it, as though calling her by name would make the story smaller, more human. But eventually they did. Martha Greaves, the widow with the cellar. By May, the road thawed. The wagons came more often, carrying letters from kin thought lost, supplies from the coast, books from the capital. The settlement began rebuilding, not with celebration but with reverence and guilt. Sheriff Benjamin Colt stood at the edge of her property one morning and looked at the half-collapsed snow mound where the cellar entrance had once been. The thaw had sunk it low, and weeds were already reaching for it like fingers. He waited until she noticed him. "You could turn it into a well," he said. She looked up from the bundle of turnips she was sorting. Her hands were clean again, her hair combed. There was color in her cheeks, but it was hard-earned and shallow. She'd never fully recover, not from that kind of winter. "I'd rather fill it," she said. "Let the ground have it back." He nodded, then quieter. "I was wrong." She didn't speak. He went on. "About you, about that cellar. I thought you were trying to pretend the snow wasn't coming, that you'd lost your senses." "You weren't the only one," she said. He paused. "I know, but you were right." She looked at him finally. "No, I wasn't right. I was desperate. That's not the same thing." "But it worked." She stood then, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked toward him. When she stopped, she was close enough that he could see the white streak in her hair that hadn't been there the year before. "It didn't work," she said. "We nearly died." "But you didn't." "Only because the snow didn't last longer." He hesitated. "And if it had?" She looked toward the forest where green was just beginning to show. "Then I would have buried the food deeper." He tried to smile. She didn't return it. "What I'm saying is," he began. "I know what you're saying," she interrupted. "You want to help now. You want to make it right." He looked away. She stepped past him. "Then help the next woman who builds something the men don't understand?" That was all she said. He watched her walk back to her cabin, head high, shoulders square. She didn't limp anymore. The old wound in her leg had healed with the weather. Others came too. A group of women, quiet and soft-handed, asked if she would show them how to build a cellar of their own before next winter. They didn't laugh. They brought shovels. One even brought a pig's shoulder wrapped in saltcloth. "Payment," she said, "for knowledge." Martha didn't say no. She led them to the edge of her property and pointed where the land sloped and the trees blocked the wind. She showed them how deep to dig, how to reinforce the back with stone, how to layer ash and snow to keep the air dry. "You don't build for now," she said. "You build for the third storm, the one that comes after the men think it's over." And they listened. Even the children watched her differently now. Daniel, especially. He had grown inches since the thaw, his hands calloused, not from play but from weeks spent dragging wood, hauling snow, slicing meat. He carried himself differently, stood straighter, and sometimes, only sometimes, he'd catch her looking at him too long and smile. What? He'd ask. She'd shake her head. Nothing, just remembering. Rachel's fever never returned. The tinctures had done their work. Her hair grew out again, wild and knotted, and she returned to chasing chickens with a stick and screaming at beetles like they were demons. Life had returned to her limbs, but something quieter had taken root in her eyes. She no longer cried when hungry. She no longer asked if spring was coming. She simply waited. A girl who had learned how to live through silence. One morning, after the fields had thawed enough to show grass and the smoke from the chimneys had lessened, a man rode into town carrying nothing but a notebook and a wire-bound satchel. He said he was from the territory recorder's office, said he'd heard of a woman who fed a family through a whiteout with nothing but a snow pit. He found her splitting kindling behind the cabin. "You the widow Greaves?" he asked. "I am," she replied, not stopping. "I was hoping you'd give a statement." "A what?" "For the archive," he said. "We're collecting stories, heroic ones, of those who braved the great winter." She paused, looked at him. "I'm not a story," she said. "But ma'am, what you did?" "I did what any mother would," she said. "I buried meat in the ground, and I prayed the snow wouldn't last longer than the marrow." He tried to smile. "Well, that's a fine line. I could quote you on that." She looked at him then with something sharper than exhaustion, a kind of weariness that didn't come from the body, but from the soul. "No one should quote me," she said. "They should prepare. They should build low and deep. They should teach their daughters to swing hatchets and their sons to sit quietly when there's no food left." The man hesitated. "Still, would you mind if I at least wrote down your name?" She returned to her splitting. "You already did." He waited a while, then left. Martha didn't watch him go. That evening, she stood before the old cellar one last time. The thaw had exposed its stones like old bones. The roof sagged inward. A fox had left paw prints near the edge. She stepped to the mouth and pulled the last of the timber down. The lid collapsed, and with it the wall of snow behind. The whole structure fell in on itself, and the earth swallowed it again. She said nothing, no ceremony, just dirt and silence. Daniel stood beside her. "We won't use it again?" She shook her head. "We'll build another, better." He nodded. He didn't ask when. He knew they both did, because the winter had taught them something most never learn until too late. That warmth is borrowed, that hunger returns, and that buried beneath snow and stone and silence, what survives is not the strongest, but the one who remembers. So they remembered, and when the first frost returned that fall, Martha Greaves and her 2 children stood in a different spot, shovels in hand, eyes on the earth, digging again. But this time, they weren't alone. 3 other families joined them, then 5. By the end of the week, half the town was measuring ground, marking walls, learning to bury what might one day save them. No one laughed, not even once.